This is Tim Cronin, assistant baseball coach at Seton Hill University with Figure It Out Baseball. In this video, we're going to talk to you guys a little bit about pitch design with sliders. In my opinion, this is one of the harder pitches to throw. I think a lot of athletes think they throw sliders, but they're not true sliders. When we throw a true slider, we're looking for a lot of horizontal, a lot of sideways movement, and not a lot of up and down movement. I think this is the hardest pitch to grasp for young athletes. I think at the big league level, guys throw some really good sliders, but at the college and the high school level and the youth level, I think a curveball is probably an easier pitch for guys to grasp. But in terms of a slider, again, like any other pitch, whatever guys prefer in terms of grip. A lot of guys, to be honest with you, grip the slider pretty similarly to how they grip the curveball. It's just the release. So this could be a grip for a slider. Some guys like to come across. Although this is more of a true cutter grip, some guys can throw it like a slider. You kind of just go across the four seams and then tilt the ball a little bit. Again, just like the curveball, we want to use any seam that we can get as leverage. When we talked about the curveball before, we mentioned that we wanted the middle finger to be as dominant as possible. That's a true middle finger dominant pitch. When we throw a slider, that's not necessarily the case. I think we can be not necessarily full index finger dominant, but we can use more of the index finger than what we did in terms of the curveball. So once again, the curveball, we want as much top-down movement as we can. With a slider, we want to get as much horizontal movement as we can. I've also seen some guys effectives on the slider is actually splitting the grip a little bit, and by splitting the grip, it allows for more even finger pressure distribution. The biggest thing with the slider, and I'm sure guys have heard it before, is just the mentality in which we want to throw it. This is a pitch that's supposed to be thrown pretty hard. You see even at the big league level, guys like Noah Syndergaard, they're throwing sliders in the low, even sometimes to the mid 90s. So this is a pitch that should have ideally maybe between 5 and 8 miles an hour difference from our fastball. 5 on the higher end. I would say if it's a true slider, it shouldn't be any more than 9, 10 max in terms of difference in miles per hour between our fastball. A good mentality for the slider is you really want to throw it like a fastball until the very end, and then at the very end you just want to apply a little bit of cut on the baseball. I think that's the easiest way to throw it. If you start trying to throw the slider back here in the back of your arm circle or your arm swing, I think it tends to come out a little more curveball-y. But if you think fastball the whole way, I think that's better for intent purposes and velocity purposes, and I think you're going to get a more true slider. A slider is easier to throw for someone that comes from a lower arm slot. Like I mentioned before, guys who come from a lower arm slot, it's harder to throw that up and down curveball, but it's easier to throw a slider just because the way the ball will come off our hands because of that slot, it already implies some of the spin on the baseball that we're looking for. Guys, and vice versa, guys that come from a high arm slot, come from up here, a low 3/4 or a true over the top, they would have an easier time with that curveball and probably a harder time with the slider just because it's not easy to imply a lot of sideways movement when you throw the ball from up here. I think those are the biggest things with the slider. Teaching a young athlete to throw a slider, I think softballs is something that we use, again, just like we do for the curveballs. We don't use a whole lot of hockey pucks in terms of a slider. Having, technology, if some guys are fortunate enough to have the technology, look at the sliders and see if it's actually a slider that your athlete is throwing. That release with the slider, when we get the ball out front, we ideally, now I mentioned that we want to be more index finger dominant, but our middle finger will be the last thing to release off the baseball. So, as we have that fastball mentality, we get to the very end, we kind of just want to imply some spin in this direction, which would be the middle finger kind of pulling it and getting on the side of the baseball. With a curveball, we want to stay on top of it and pull down. With a slider, we want to come more on the side of it. And by coming more on the side of it, we'll be able to manipulate the ball and tilt that axis down and tilt the ball and create more horizontal run rather than vertical. Some issues you may have with your athletes in terms of throwing a slider. If a guy throws 85 and he tends to throw a slider at 72, that might be a little too slow, and you're wondering how we can maybe get that slider to tick up a little bit in velocity. I think the easiest way for that would probably be just looking at the grip. If they throw their fastball like this, simply tell them to put their fingers together and tilt the baseball a tiny bit, and then tell them to throw a fastball. And I think that the grip change and simply just angling the ball a little bit in your hand will allow them to throw more of a true slider. And if you tell them the whole time they're doing this to simply have a fastball mentality, I think that could be beneficial. If you keep them in their normal slider grip, they might have that mindset that it is more of a slider. But if you go to that fastball grip, say put your fingers together and simply tilt the ball a little bit, I think that'd be beneficial. Certainly help in terms of velocity and also give the ball a little truer slider movement. So in terms of grips with sliders, I mentioned right here you can do. You can also come up more on the baseball on this. I think that's beneficial too, because as you turn the baseball and come up here, you allow your thumb on the bottom seam here to apply some more leverage on the baseball. Also, I've seen guys come, if this is the front, tilt it all the way around and come to the bottom right here and kind of bury their middle finger on the edge of that seam, and then they can use their thumb right here on this outside seam to imply leverage on the ball. So, and also you can go with the four seam. I think this would morph into more of a cuttery slider. These would be more true sliders. But at the end of the day, if your athlete throws it with a fastball mentality and releases it right, I think they can throw a slider with pretty much any of these grips, as long as the mentality and the release point is right. I don't think there's one way to do it. There's not a right or wrong way to grip this pitch. This is Tim Cronin from Seton Hill University. This is my video on pitch design in terms of a slider. Check out my next video, which is going to be pitch design involving changeups.